morning. Oh, morning. I still feel weird, like hearing yourself over a speaker still feels strange to me. That's okay, I'm not going anywhere. No, Gary Clark. He's going to do it, yeah. Yeah, same order as usual. Nothing, no surprises. Yeah, we're pretty predictable. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad you're here today. Thank you for coming. I'm going to make a couple of adjustments up here so that I don't run into anything. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to replace this one eventually. I'm convinced I'm going to trip on this at some point. I think it's just a matter of time. We actually had Olivia almost tripped on Sunday. I felt pretty bad about that. Okay, a couple of things. So thanks for being here. We're going to shoot through a few chapters today. So we'll get started in that in just a moment. Have a couple of fun things to share with you. One of them is that we had a meeting of the administrative team last night, and we started to kind of work our way through a few different things. One of them was Wednesday nights. They're going to keep talking, I think, about what to do on Wednesday nights and honestly, whether or not to do something on Wednesday nights. We have some other things going on, so we may look at something in the fall. We also talked about taking about a year off and trying some special things to see what's going to, how people respond. So I think right now, through the family ministries, they're talking about having 2 or 3 movie nights, kind of sporadically throughout the summer. If the weather's good, they might do something outside, kind of like we've done with the pumpkin patch, I guess, maybe like a cookout and an outdoor movie or something. So once, I don't have the dates for those yet, but once we've got them, we'll start advertising them so you can know when they're going to happen. And then they also talked about whether or not to do something for the 4th of July again this year. So they're going to, I think, talk about that again in May. So that was fun to kind of be a part of and to know that those conversations are coming. They also started talking about whether or not we're far enough outside of the worst part of the pandemic to go ahead and start talking with other organizations about the possibility of having like a basketball league or something that meets in here. So I think they want to spend some time exploring that and seeing what that would look like too. But they're fun conversations at any rate. So it'd be kind of fun to do some of that stuff if we end up having the support to do it. Gary Clark is going to be preaching this coming Sunday. He's going to be in both services. I am going to be up bright and early to go downtown for the marathon, which I think starts at 6:30 is supposed to be the kickoff for the full marathon run. When I did the half starts an hour later, so I got to start at 7:30, so I got to get up earlier, which I'm hoping I'll survive. There's supposed to be bad weather, so it might keep us in your prayer this weekend. I asked them what their plan was for that, and apparently they just kind of delay start times until the weather is good. There's not really anywhere to stand, so we just stand in the corrals in the bad weather while we're waiting for it to change. So we'll see how it goes. Looking forward to doing it. I think it's going to be a good time. Kate, if you have any interest at all in doing so, we'll put out on one of our social media accounts somewhere the bib number, my bib number. You can track that on the app. So if you want to actually follow me around the course, you can do that. They have, the bibs have these little magnetic trackers in them. So at different kind of choke points around the race area, you run over this sensor and it tracks your particular bib so that it kind of says, you're exactly here. And then based on the time you're running, it sort of estimates where you are in between the different sensors. So it's kind of cool the way they do it. There's a couple of key points there on the race. I was telling somebody about this earlier this week. They've got this one area called Gorilla Hill. And I heard about this because I read about it before I did the race the first time. It's supposed to be like this terrible hill, like this awful hill that everybody dies on. So there's a whole bunch of people that flock there. They have this big blow-up awning thing, like a banner that you run under, and they have a big blow-up gorilla. People dress up in gorilla costumes, and they hand out bananas, which is it's like the last thing you want to eat while you're, running is a banana. But I got there, and it had been so hyped up that when I got there and I saw it at first, I thought, there must be more to this hill that I can't see. Like, I remember being in the Army and road marching, and I'd get to what I thought was the top of something, only to find out that it was just where I could see the rest of whatever I was walking. So it's like, maybe it's one of those. I got to the top of it, and it was the top of it. And I was like, this isn't that bad at all, which was terrible, because the worst part about that was that was the hill that everybody had talked about. And so I'm like, I got through this. I'm great. I'm going to be good to go. Nobody told me about the last hill on the course, which is like 40 times that long, and thought I was going to die because I'd expended all my energy. So it'll be a good time, and if you get a chance to follow, I'd certainly love your prayers and your support. I also had a conversation last night about the start of the trafficking outreach that I have brought up several times. We've had a really good response to that. In fact, the initial response to that has involved more people than the initial response early on to the homeless ministry several years ago. And so if number of people interested is any indication, and I think it is, of interest, then I'm excited about that. So one of the things that came up last night was a valid, good question about kind of, what is our focus going to be? Are we going to go in and actively rescue girls? Are we going to try to have a way for them to recover, et cetera? And I said, well, one of the things I shared with them is that, for starters, no, I'm not looking to put together a group of Delta Force operatives who are going to go in and storm truck stops. I don't think that's probably in our skill set together. But my next answer to that was, I think it would be ridiculous of us to have worked to begin a ministry like the homeless outreach ministry that we have that is, reaching so many people, and then not use the lessons that we learned in the creation of that ministry for the next thing that we do. And so I intend to approach it the same way. I want to take about a year, and I want to learn what we don't know about this. I don't even think we can effectively figure out where we plug ourselves into an outreach like that until we know more about it and start matching up our skill set with what's actually needed. So a couple of people have, more than a couple of people have shared with me a number of places doing a lot of things. One of the places that was mentioned to me was actually just in the news last week in an article about this. And so we're going to spend the better part of the next year just trying to learn and figure out how we can begin to make a meaningful difference here. I intend to, told the people that have already responded in an email that my intent is early next week to set a meeting for mid-May. I want to have a conversation. I wanted to talk to the administrative team last night. I want to have another conversation with the homeless outreach ministry on May 1st. We're going to be talking about setting up a separate 501c3 for the church for a couple of reasons. One of them, most important to me, is that we are missing out on some grant funding that is not available to us because we are a church. There are a couple of other churches in the metro. Shawnee First United Methodist Church in particular has just done this kind of successfully, who've said, okay, well, we'll start another separate 501c3 nonprofit that can have access to some of these funds that are not as available to churches. And we'll be kind of intentional about setting up the board and the structure so that it remains connected to the church. But I want to kind of take a look at the idea, anyway, as a nonprofit that would umbrella our outreach ministries. So, we have the homeless outreach, probably also the trafficking outreach, and keep the structure there for anything down the road that the church may choose to do at the time. Funding is the major reason we want to do that, or that I want to do that. Liability is another good reason, too. If there ever is, God forbid, a liability issue, that liability would rest with that particular 501c3 and not with the church itself. And so there's a little bit of accountability separation there going on. So partly I'm bringing that up to you because I want you to know what conversations are happening right now in the church. Also, if you have an interest in those things, come to the meeting on May 1st. If for no other reason than to hear straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, what the dialogue is and what the discussion is. May 1st at 3, I think we're going to meet right in here in the Ministry Center. So love to have you there for that. Okay, that's all the things. Today, we're actually in Genesis 10. But Genesis 10 and most of Genesis 11 are genealogies. And so I'm going to do what I did previously, and I'm just going to kind of read through those. I want to highlight a couple of areas to you so they stick in your brain for the next chapters. But I'll stop briefly at the first part of Genesis 11, because that's the part of Genesis that deals with the Tower of Babel. And that can be confusing, so we'll talk about that for a minute. But then my hope is to go ahead and go through Genesis 12. Genesis 12 is a relatively short chapter, and there's really only a couple of key elements to it. But one of them has to do with the first episode, in which Sarai is presented as Abram's sister instead of as Abram's wife, and Pharaoh ends up getting punished for this sin of ignorance. So we're going to talk about that a little bit too. As you know, the scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray, so let's go ahead and do that. God, we're grateful for today and for the opportunity to be here to learn more about who you are and who you are calling us to be. God, we pray for our friends who are unable to be with us today, wherever they might be, and for all of those who will participate today or at any other time. But we also pray, God, that you would open our own hearts, our own minds, and our own spirits, so that as a result of the time that we're spending together learning, we might better know you, and we might increase the number of tools that we have to better understand the faith that we practice. This we ask in your name. Amen. All right, so let's go through this set of descendants of Noah here in chapter 10. Again, these are the people through which the world is repopulated, and God has told them post-flood to go and be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the world. Unlike the early part of Genesis, where we see that there are just, three kids of Adam who end up going off and finding wives somewhere. I believe it was the land of Nod, if I remember correctly. And we're like, where did these other humans come from? We talked about that. Here, we're given a little bit more information about where the other people came from and where the rest of the world's culture comes from. As we talked about before, historically, there is some evidence that there was a bottleneck in human history, genealogical bottleneck, that kind of puts most of us most likely descending from one of a very small number of ancestors. So there's a precedent for that. There's a precedent for the flood. But we're moving into the post-flood era, which means that we're about to move into what is called the Abrahamic cycle, which has to do with the meeting out of God's covenant to Abraham. So we've seen the promises made to Adam. We've seen the promises made to Noah, which is often called the Noahic Covenant. The way this is commonly understood is in the evolution of the Old Covenant. So while I will talk about the Abrahamic Covenant, the difference between that and the Noahic Covenant, which are just references to Abraham and Noah, that's just how you say it. Theologically, what we're seeing is the evolution of the creation of what will come to be called the Old Covenant, which mostly is going to be shared. It's going to start with Abraham, and there's going to be a lot that's given there. In the next 2 or 3 chapters, we'll understand a lot of that, and then later, of course, meted out through Moses. All right, so here we go. These are the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, to whom children were born after the flood. Japheth's sons, Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Gomer's sons, Ashkenaz, Riphath, and I don't know how to say that one, Togarma, I think is probably how it would be pronounced. Javan's sons, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. From these, the island nations were divided into their own countries. Now listen to this. Each according to their languages and their clans within their nations. So that's going to be important when we get to chapter 11, where we see this reference to the idea that everybody has the same language, where I think there are 3 different times here in chapter 10 where we're told that there are different languages. Just note that for now. We'll talk about it in a minute. These are Ham's sons. Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. You should notice that a lot of the names of the offspring correlate to the later names of places. Some of that should be very obvious. So Cush's sons, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. Rama's sons, Sheba and Dedan. Cush fathered Nimrod, the first great warrior on earth. The Lord saw him as a great hunter, and so it is said, like Nimrod, whom the Lord saw as a great hunter. The most important cities in his kingdom were Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Asher, now Shinar is Sumer. And there's a lot of scholars have tried for a long time to figure out why it's written here as Shinar instead of as Sumer. Because it is Sumer. They've talked about whether or not there's a dialectic issue going on there. It might have sounded like that in the language or something, they don't know, but it's Sumer, and that's important in a minute. Asher left that land and built Nineveh, Rehoboth city, Calah, and Resen, the great city between Nineveh and Calah. Egypt fathered Ludim, Anamim, Lehabim, and Naphtahim, Pathrusim, Kalushim, and Caphtorim, from which the Philistines came. Canaan fathered Sidon, his oldest son, and Heth, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, the Arkites, and the Sinites, the Arvadites, and the Zemarites, and the Hamathites. And after this, the Canaanite clans were dispersed. The Canaanite boundary extends from Sidon by way of Gerar to Gaza, and by way of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim to Lasha. These are Ham's sons, listen to this again, according to their clans, their languages, plural, their lands, and their nations. Children were also born to Shem, the father of all Eber's children and Japheth's older brother. Shem's sons, Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. Aram's sons, Uz, Hol, Gether, and Mash. Arpachshad fathered Shelah, and Shelah fathered Aber. To Aber were born two sons. The first was named Peleg, because during his lifetime the earth was divided. His brother's name was Joktan. Joktan fathered Almadad, Sheleph, and Hazarmaveth. Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, Deklah, Obal, Abimael, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All of these were Joktan's sons. Their settlements extended from Mesha by way of Sephar, the eastern mountains. There's a lot of reference, like over and over again, to the east. Like over and over again, things happening in the east. People go to the east. The east is guarded. And scholars have kind of tried to focus on that because there's not a lot of great information as to why there's such a strong focus on the east, but it just comes up over and over again. There are Shem's sons according to their clans, these are Shem's sons according to their clans. Here we go. Their languages, again, their lands and their nations. These are the clans of Noah's sons according to the generations and their nations from the earth's nations branched out after the flood. So what you're seeing there is not only what accounts for the Hebrews as a historic record, but also this is how Noah and Noah's family lived into God's command to be fruitful and multiply. And if you're particularly reading this in antiquity or encountering it there, you're getting the origins of places and peoples. So these peoples come from these peoples. This place is connected to these peoples. So you'd be looking at that and saying, oh, okay, yeah, that's where that came from. Kansas came from this. Oklahoma came from this. It would be that same kind of feeling. Okay, so here we have chapter 11. We're going to move into that because by this point we're told that everybody has one language. So there's a couple of things that could be happening here. One is that we could be witnessing an intentional movement backward on the timeline, where we just went through chapter 10, all these things have happened, but now we're going back and getting a story that kind of outlines how those things happen, how everybody ended up with different languages. There's not really an awful lot of support for that theory, though it's out there. Probably the most support comes from the idea of what is commonly called a lingua franca, or like a trade language. A lot of cultures throughout human history have had a shared language for use in trade. You see that in the Indo-European languages. You see it in the tribal languages of North America. There's often a trade language. And so a lot of scholars kind of think that's probably what's being discussed here. So not so much that there is only actually one language, because we were just told that there are several languages in the previous chapter, but that there's a common language being used to coordinate the different groups of people and the different clans, cultures, and languages. Nonetheless, there's an ability that the peoples, the clans, and the cultures have evolved. That's what we get out of chapter 10. That post-flood, people have evolved through the generations such that the cultures changed, they evolved, and the languages changed, they evolved. That happens. You've got enough history schooling to know that. A language will, over time, turn into a language with multiple dialects, and as more time goes by, those dialects become different languages, right? English itself is a Germanic language that came from the Angles, which was a Germanic tribe that ended up migrating in large numbers to the British Isles, along with, who was it, the Utes and the Saxons, I think, if I remember correctly. English was originally English, which was a German dialect that became what we're speaking today, which has evolved since the movement or migration from the British Isles to America. And then around America today, there are different dialects as well. I read a really interesting article about a year ago by an anthropologist who was identifying the different major dialects of English spoken in the U.S. and gave a theory about how many generations we are away from those dialects becoming different languages yet again. And so that just happens. That's normal. So what we're seeing in chapter 10 is that happened. As languages evolve, cultures also evolve, right? When one group spreads to another place, they carry their cultures with them, but over time, the evolution of the culture as it develops in this new place is going to have other influences. It's also going to be removed from where it came from, so the culture is going to evolve some. There are a number of, if you're even looking at the European immigration to America, there are a number of traditions that would have found their way across the Atlantic, but are now not practiced today in the same way that they might have evolved in other parts of Europe where they would have originated. So that's just part of what you're seeing here. But then in Babylon, with regard to the story of the Tower of Babel, enough time, and this I think this is probably the right theory myself, but enough time has gone by that these different cultures have developed a common language for the use of trade. And so they've come together and they've decided to build this tower. This is another instance in which the story that we're coming across is not a story that's just in the Bible. The Tower of Babel is also part of the ancient Sumerian text, so it's one of those things that is there, right? Tower of Babel is destroyed, and even in the ancient Sumerian text, which I had a chance to read through just the other day, the cultures and the people are scattered. So this is seen as a major moment in human history in this region of the world in which cultures and people are scattered again, and for whatever the reason, and both the Sumerian text and the Genesis text identify the active work of a deity as the reason, punishment for something, and I'll get to that in a minute. But for whatever the reason, historically, the trade language goes away as the tower itself is destroyed. So, in the ancient Sumerian text, the destruction of the tower has a different reason behind it. Here, we see that God sees that humans are trying to build a tower. In the ancient Sumerian text, it says that the tower was built up with its heights in the heavens. And in the heavens is a pretty common description, even throughout different parts of the biblical text, for something that's just, it's really high, right? So there are a couple of theories about what it is that angers God about this. But let's read this short passage. So let's read it first, and I'll come back and try to explain a few things. So all the people on the earth had one language and the same words. When they traveled east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. Again, Sumer. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them hard." When you read that in Hebrew, it actually says, "Let's brick bricks." Let's brick bricks. and make them hard. They used bricks for stones and asphalt for mortar. And actually, in that phrase, it says the bricks and the asphalt were given them for use as bricks and as stones and mortar. They said, "Come, let's build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky." Does your version say sky or heavens? Does anybody have one that says heavens? Okay. And let's make a name for ourselves so that we won't be dispersed all over the earth. All right, so on the one hand, you're talking about humans trying to make a name for themselves. That's going to be contrasted with God offering to be responsible for Abram's legacy. So there's a contrast between humans trying to do this for themselves and God doing this for humans who are subservient to God. And that's one of the things that often comes out of a reading of this that's not researched very well, but we'll get to that in a second. So we won't be dispersed all over there. So we're given a reason, right? They want to build this city, they want to build this tower, and part of the reason is because they don't want to be dispersed all over the earth, except that we've already been told that they are dispersed, like the clans and the cultures are dispersed. So there's an idea here, and many theologians, ministers, preachers have alighted on the idea that there's this hubris involved in the attempt to build a city, and it angers God, so God destroys it. That might be okay as an interpretation if God had come down and destroyed every other city in the rest of human history. Like we don't have other instances of God being like, cities are evil, you will not live in them, and I will smite all of them. You know, like we live in a city right now, God has not smited the city that we live in, thankfully. So there's a disconnect between that theology that it's just simply the city itself, the idea of building a city that represents human hubris and the desire to achieve things. You know, we're going to move into Abram going into Egypt and some of the grand structures that have evolved in Egypt over time as well. So not theologically, probably not the best interpretation. There is an interpretation of this, however, that does make sense, and I'll get to it in a second. So verse 5. So the Lord came down. Now there's an interesting juxtaposition here, right? And you're supposed to catch the humor in that the people are trying to build a tower that is tall enough to reach to God. But God has to come down just to be able to see it, which is supposed to say, you know, they didn't even get close. Like God couldn't even see it from where God was. Don't take that out too far and be like, I thought God was omniscient and could see, you know, omnipresent, could see everything. That's not what that means. It's just supposed to be a joke that says that they failed, right? So the Lord came down to see the city and the tower and that the humans had built. And the Lord said, there is now one people and they'll have one language, and this is what they've begun to do. And now all that they plan to do will be possible for them. Come, let's go down and mix up their language so that they won't understand each other's language. Then the Lord dispersed them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, it is named Babel, because the Lord mixed up the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over all the earth. So you have kind of a conflagration of things here, not the least of which is that a lot of that mirrors some of the ancient Sumerian story. That God confuses their language, the people are building a tower. In the Sumerian account of the text, the tower, and this is probably a better interpretation of what you're seeing here. What you're seeing here is, I think, and I agree with the scholars who say this, is probably multifaceted. Like some of the other parts of Genesis, I think you also have an attempt to take a story that is common to the culture and contextualize it within what is becoming the Hebrew faith, the ancient Israelite faith. So taking stories that are common. A lot of the stories, as we've talked about, that we're seeing in the first part of Genesis predate the culture of ancient Israel. They come from the region in which ancient Israel developed. That's not a weird thing. Sometimes when that comes up in a Bible study, people will be like, oh, I thought everything started with this. You know, it's a little hard to because we don't do that. You know, all of our traditions are our own. That's not the case. All of our traditions that come into a religious practice don't originate with that religious practice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So if they had one language, where does this third language come from?
Right. So that's a yeah, it's a good question. And I think let me go back to kind of flesh that out again. That's probably, again, I think that's the theory that makes the most sense. Definitely most of the scholars seem to think that makes the most sense. And the reason is because of how this conflicts with what we just read in chapter 10 that says that we have, all of these languages have evolved. There's no sense that after having all of these languages that have evolved and all of the different evolutions of the cultures that we just got through that whole genealogy, that those languages had evolved back into one. And so they take the use of, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it's the jussive use of the verb here that is used to identify that they had one language. And they've interpreted the way that sounds to be more like they had a language. They had a language in common. And so they're trying to take a look at that and say, well, what makes the most sense? And either it's we're seeing this go back in time before we read what happens in Genesis 10, but that doesn't match up very well. And so they try to take the interpretation of that phrase in Hebrew that makes the most sense, which was not there was only one language, but that they had a language. They had a common language. And so now, as far as that theory goes, that's the best that it's fleshed out. And I think that scholars in particular, and myself included, tend to ascribe to it because it makes the most sense. But it also doesn't answer all the questions. It would be simple to say, there's just one language at this time, and this is the origination of the evolution of different languages because God confuses them. That would be, I think, the easiest interpretation, if not for chapter 10. Chapter 10 kind of throws that into a loop because we have these three different examples of how the languages evolved. And in each of those, when we're going through the major sons of Noah, and at the end of it, it says their clans and their languages and their cultures or whatever it says, in each of those, what we get is that the clans and the languages and the cultures came from the generational evolution of the distribution of the sons of Noah, not that God intentionally created different languages there. And so there's this dichotomy between 10 and 11. There are a couple of theories that obviously Genesis is written by more than one person, and maybe there was this one explanation of languages, and they put that in chapter 10. And then there's another explanation of languages, and they put that in chapter 11. That's possible. Yeah, I wish I could give a better answer, but I think beyond those interpretations, I think it's confusing enough. Let me go back to where I was, if I can get myself back to where I was. Oh, no. I'd love to answer questions. My brain just doesn't work the way it once did. So we have the idea that God is, actively involved in this. And that, again, matches the story of the ancient Sumerian text. But in the ancient Sumerian text, because, again, a lot of these stories predate Hebrew culture. And so again, we see that over and over again, the evolution of a religion that brings in other cultural traditions. I think one of the best examples that has always helped me to wrap my mind around that is the sheer number of Christmas traditions that have their origination in pagan religiosity. Like almost everything related to evergreen stuff comes from Norse paganism. Not from Christianity, and it kind of melded into Christianity when Christianity became common in the Norse parts of the world. They took the things they were already doing to celebrate and Christianized them. So that's not an uncommon thing. We're very comfortable with that already, and we see a lot of that here. We see these stories that predate Hebrew culture making their way into Hebrew culture, but getting morphed a little bit, and that's one of the things that could be going on here. Because in the Sumerian text, the tower is built to honor Marduk, which is the supreme deity. Again, the early part of Genesis mirrors the story of Marduk and Tiamat, so you see a lot of overlap there. But like in the first part of Genesis, where you see the story of Marduk and Tiamat kind of fleshed out, you see it fleshed out differently, where ancient Israelite culture is saying, your story, we get the story, it's our story, the story's right, but it's not right because it's not about Marduk, it's about God, right? So one of the interpretations about what's going on here, and I think there's probably some merit to it, is that part of what's happening is this ancient Israelite reappropriation or contextualization of this ancient Mesopotamian story, that there's a tower built to honor Marduk, but that angers God. That building of the tower to honor Marduk angers God, so God comes down and destroys the tower. That's not perfectly fleshed out in the story. You see some other things here, particularly like what God says about, there's one people, they have one language, it's what they've begun to do now that they plan to do what will be impossible for them. In the Sumerian text, and this is maybe, if you think that what's going on here is that people are trying to reach God, that most of that comes out of the Sumerian text. They're building this tower to try to get up to where they can reach Marduk, which is a sign of hubris, right? And so some of what you see written here is really similar to what's in those texts about how, in that case, Marduk responds to what's happening there and the hubris involved in it. So all of that is to say, there are scholars, and I think there's some merit in this, though I don't think it fleshes out completely with the reading, that the people have built a tower to another god. That this is one of the first instances we're seeing of idolatry or polytheism in the ancient world, and God comes to change that so that it ostensibly, hopefully, won't continue. And in so doing, again, confuses the language of the people and disperses them, but there's not a good reason given as to why, just so that they won't be able to do what they've been doing. So the question you're left with is, do what they've been doing in what capacity? Build a city, build a tower, engage in idolatry, engage in polytheism. Could be any of those things or all of those things. And that becomes confusing about this story. So in my humble opinion, I don't think any one of those interpretations matches the reading 100%. And so because of that, I think there are problems with all of them. But the idea that we're seeing a story here that predates the culture that we're talking about, and also then kind of seeks to contextualize that story within the ancient Israelite theology, that makes a lot of sense to me. That there's a tower here, it's being built to Marduk, that upsets God, God destroys that, confuses the language so that this budding worship of another deity or budding idolatry is squashed and doesn't continue, although it will. It will evolve again in the course of human history. I know that's a lot to stomach. Do you have any questions about that? Any more questions before we move on? Okay, well, as you think of them, make sure you bring them up. Let's go through the rest of this descendancy, and then we'll get into the even more confusing story of why Abram makes his wife somebody else's wife. These are Shem's descendants. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arpachshad. This is how you know that the minister doesn't like you. When the minister gives you this text to read on Sunday morning in front of everybody. All right. 2 years after the flood, I actually made that joke once several years ago, and then, like a fool, that text was coming up in the next couple of weeks. Somebody was like, "You don't like me?" I was like, "No, no." After Arpachshad was born, Shem lived 500 years. He had other sons and daughters. Why so many times? When Arpachshad was 35 years old, he became the father of Shelah. After Shelah was born, Arpachshad lived 403 years. He had other sons and daughters. When Shelah was 30 years old, he became the father of Aber. After Aber was born, Shelah lived 403 years. He had other sons and daughters. When Aber was 34 years old, he became the father of Peleg. After Peleg was born, Aber lived 430 years, and he had other sons and daughters. You notice how we still have these really long lifespans, but they're not as long as they were before, right? They're starting to get shorter. Where were we? When Peleg was 30 years old, he became the father of Ru. After Ru was born, Peleg lived 209 years. He had other sons and daughters. When Ru was 32 years old, he became the father of Serug. After Serug was born, Ru lived 207 years. He had other sons and daughters. When Serug was 30 years old, he became the father of Nahor. After Nahor was born, Sarah lived 200 years. He had other sons and daughters. When Nahor was 29 years old, he became the father of Terah. After Terah was born, Nahor lived 119 years. So we've gone in this set of genealogies over this number of generations from about 500 years, which is how long Shem lived, to about 100 years old. So we're getting post-flood now. We're pretty close to an average lifespan for today, although that lifespan is going to go down and then come back up. Yeah. The question, if you're watching, is what do I think the purpose of listing the ages is of all those people? I think it's, again, multifaceted. I think that there's an attempt there to some degree to get a little bit of historical accuracy in the way that it would have been commonly recorded at the time, but also to, in terms of ages, to show the decrease in lifespan. And you see the same thing. Now, this is common, right? In the list of the ancient Sumerian kings, in their genealogies, you get all of their lifespan. So-and-so lived for X number of years and then died. So I think that's a common way to do this at the time. But I also think that what we're seeing is the shortening of lifespans, because there's a direct link there. Like the lifespans are getting incrementally shorter, right? So if I'm showing up in the story around the time I would have shown up in the story if I would have been an ancient Israelite, and I'm hearing the stories of our people, and I know that we're living on average for like 50 years at this point, but then, you know, our great ancestors were living for 900 years or 700 years, and then I have a question about what got us from here to here, right? In the genealogy, I see that it kind of moves down fairly gradually. Is there a good reason for it? Not given in the scriptures, but the stories about the Imago Dei remains with us after we're ejected from the garden, but the immortality that's originally ours seems to leach away slowly, and that's an old teaching. That's a teaching that's been around in ancient Israel, ancient Hebrew, the ancient Jewish faith for a really long time by word of mouth. So while you don't see that in here, that's the common reason given. How did we get here? Generationally. Why did we get here? Because the immortality that was original to us takes a while to leach away after we go out of the garden. Does that help? I hope a little. Alrighty, so Nahor was 119 years, had other sons and daughters. When Terah was 70, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. These are Terah's descendants. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died while with his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor both married. Abram's wife was Sarai, and Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, father of both Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was unable to have children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his sons and his son Abram's wife Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and they left Ur of the Chaldeans for the land of Canaan, arriving at Haran, and they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. Okay, for the rest of our time together, let's take a look at chapter 12, because there's some interesting stuff here. Now, there's a practice amongst the nobles in Haran. It's a Haruian, I think the way you say it is Haruian practice, wherein nobles would sometimes, and remember, and we're talking about a patriarchal culture in which everybody is property. So we focus often on the fact that women are property. They are everybody's property, the property of the patriarch. And so in this case, the wife of whoever you're talking about is that person's property. So there's a practice in Haran where women are sometimes made into sisters. And then often, after they're made into sisters, sometimes made into the wives of other people. So after somebody's wife would be decreed to be a sister and then married to somebody else. Some scholars think that's the origination of this practice, that Abram saw that, experienced it, and that's why it was a common thing for him to do. He does it like 3 times over the course of the Genesis narrative. Also, and they don't know if that practice evolved into what I'm about to tell you or if the two things evolved separately, but in some of the ancient Islamic liturgy, for a man to divorce his wife, he says to her, I am no longer married to you, you are now as a sister to me. And so knowing that those cultures are obviously have the same point of origination, a lot of scholars have thought that that probably indicates that there's some level of common cultural practice here that makes what Abram does in this chapter much more common in that culture than it would seem today, which is odd and strange. But let's read through it. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your land, your family, and your father's household for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name respected, and you will be a blessing." Okay, so the way that's written, there it's what's the word I'm looking? It's cause and effect related. If you leave the land that I'm commanding you to leave, then I will bless you. I will make of you a great nation. I will make your name respected, and you and others will be blessed through you. You will be a mechanism through which the rest of the world is blessed, but that's contingent upon you leaving. There's a good sermon in there about how about following God's call, about how sometimes we cannot live into our calling in the current environment that we're in, even though our gifts and talents may be the same. There's something about the environment that we're in that God is calling us away from so that we can be planted in more fertile soil. Great sermon in that. For the purposes of our class here, it's important to know that there's a direct cause and effect relationship there. You're not going to be, those blessings will not happen if you stay put, so you've got to leave in order for that to be the case. Then God makes a promise. It says, "I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you, I will curse. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." Now, that's important, right? God's going to bless whoever blesses Abram, and is going to curse whoever curses Abram. We're going to see that with Pharaoh. There are a couple of sins in the scriptures that are similar but different. One would be, and there are different ways to describe different kinds of sin, but these two are very similar. Sins of negligence and sins of ignorance are really similar but different. A sin of negligence would mean that I know that what I'm doing is not right, but I fail to do what I should do anyway. So in a sin of negligence, let me say that a little differently. In a sin of negligence, I'm avoiding doing what I know that I should do, if that might make more sense. I'm avoiding doing what I know that I should do. I know that I should do something, but I don't, okay? In a sin of ignorance, I don't know that what I did was wrong. I did something, but I didn't know that it was wrong, right? In the Old Testament in particular, there's not much quarter given for either of those two things. So not knowing, in the Old Testament theology in particular, now you see a different theology develop, much more akin to what you would understand as a theology of grace in the New Covenant, about sins, particularly sins of ignorance. But in the Old Testament in particular, there's no excuse for that. You're still going to be punished if you commit a sin out of ignorance. You do something wrong, not knowing that it's wrong, you're still going to be punished for that. We're about to see that with Pharaoh. When we read through this, ostensibly we're like, this is not Pharaoh's fault. You know, how did Pharaoh didn't know what was going on, and yet there's still a punishment there. Because in the Old Testament theology, the action is still a sin and still has consequences, regardless of whether I knew that I was committing it or not, is irrelevant, because the action still happens, and the action itself is what has consequences, which is a way to separate motivation from action. It's Jesus who talks a lot about motivation as an important factor in the Sermon on the Mount in particular, and then throughout much of the rest of his ministry. Jesus is going to say, why you do matters as much as what you do. And that was a big change for people, because prior to Jesus teaching that was not their understanding of things. Now, there's a great point to be made in that Jesus also says, yes, but your understanding of the law evolved incorrectly. So you thought a bunch of things that were never actually the case, which should lead any Christian or theologian to say, well, should people always have been punished then for sins of ignorance? Was that a cultural evolution? Is what we're seeing here evidence of a cultural evolution, or the evolution culturally of a theology that it evolved the wrong way and made its way codified into stories? There's a lot of good questions to ask there. Let's read the story. Abram left just as the Lord told him, so he was obedient. Lot went with him. Now, Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all of their possessions, and those who became members of their household in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Now, we know all these places, right, because we've heard all the names. We know where they come from. We know what the relationships are between the varying clans and cultures that have come from the different brothers, right? So we know that nobody likes the Canaanites. Abram traveled through the land as far as the sacred place at Shechem at the Oak of Moreh. The Canaanites lived in the land at the time. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, I give this land to your descendants. We knew that was going to happen. So Abram built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. So one of the things we're going to see here is this is supposed to be a bit of a contrast to chapter 11. Instead of building a tower or city, Abram builds an altar, similar to what Noah does. When Noah gets off of the boat, Noah worships. Here, Abram is going to worship, and God is going to appear to Abram. Interestingly, a couple of things that seem to define patriarchal worship, or the worship of the patriarchs, which probably should be said that way, given the understanding of patriarchy. When we're talking about the worship of the Jewish patriarchs, there are a couple of things they commonly do. One is the building of an altar, on which there's not an indication of a sacrifice here. In fact, several instances of that. So there's not an indication of a sacrifice made. And then the worship of the Word, where God's presence is invoked. Not a liturgy for that, but in each of the instances, we get an understanding that the patriarchs know God. And God, therefore, appears to the patriarchs and has dialogue with them. From there, he traveled. That's an indication, by the way, that that's not only possible, but it's exactly what God intended. So it's possible for you too. From there, he traveled toward the mountains east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There, again, he built an altar to the Lord and worshipped in the Lord's name. Then Abram set out toward the arid southern plain, making and breaking camp as he went. Now, when a famine struck the land, and there's a great precedent for this, we're going to see this several times, when a famine, and there's actually in the Sumerian records and in the Egyptian records, there's a lot of records of different people coming to Sumer, or then later, culturally later, to Egypt as a result of famines. So moving because of a famine is a common thing. Abram went down toward Egypt to live as an immigrant since the famine was so severe in the land. Just before he arrived in Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know you're a good-looking woman. Interestingly, this doesn't come up in the last instance. So here, Sarai is probably in her mid-60s. In the last instance, she should be around 89 or so. And some of the commentators are like, why didn't that come up again? You know, what was the reason for it? So she's apparently a pretty good-looking woman, and they're aware that there's a practice in Egypt of wife stealing. How Abram is aware of that practice, scholars are not really sure about, probably just because he's from the region and he knows what people do. But there's a practice of that in Egypt, ancient Egypt. You're not in danger of being killed if the woman is your sister. You are in danger of being killed if the woman is your wife and someone more powerful than you wants her to be his wife. And so that's most likely what he's worried about going into Egypt, right? And they're giving us the reason why, because she's very beautiful. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but let you live. So tell them you are my sister, so that they will treat me well for your sake, and I will survive because of you. Again, most likely a result of the couple of things we talked about that were much more common in his culture than obviously they are in our culture. So it's probably something that he was already familiar with. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw how beautiful his wife was, meaning he was right. What he anticipated was correct. When Pharaoh's princes saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's household. Now, Pharaoh doesn't know he's doing anything wrong, but the idea is that Abram would have been killed for this if they hadn't run this deception. Pharaoh will get upset about that in just a minute, but we'll get there. things went well for Abram because of her. He acquired flocks, cattle, male donkeys, men servants, women servants, female donkeys, and camels. Then the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife. So things have gone well for Abram because of Sarai. Things have gone badly for Pharaoh because of Sarai, right? She is a catalyst here for the blessing to Abraham that comes his way and the curse to Pharaoh that comes his way because of how she's treated. So Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, "What's this that you've done to me? Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife?" We're supposed to know the answer to this, right? As the reader, we're supposed to know that Abram didn't because Pharaoh would have killed him. Pharaoh's upset because he feels like he's been treated poorly, but we're sitting back here with the extra knowledge, knowing that had they not done that, Pharaoh would have killed Abram and taken her. But now, so one of the questions you may have is, and it'd be a good question, why doesn't Pharaoh just kill Abram now and take her, right? If this is already their practice, that's what they were worried about, why not just kill Abram and take Sarai? The answer to that question is most likely because by this point, through the curse or the plagues, the power behind Abram has been demonstrated. So Pharaoh is afraid of two things. One is what will happen if he harms Abram, because in the patriarchal culture they're in, Sarai is his property. So if he's harmed Abram's property, hence the curse that's been brought his direction, which is exactly what Yahweh says is going to happen. I'll curse those who curse you, bless those who bless you, right? So Pharaoh's worried. He's already seen the power behind Abram. He doesn't want to cause any further harm to himself, which he could do by either killing Abram or taking away what Abram had been given. So he does neither of those two things. He doesn't kill Abram, he doesn't take anything away, but he banishes Abram and tells Abram to leave and not come back. "Why did you say she's my sister so that I made her my wife? Now here's your wife, take her and go." Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning Abram, and they expelled him with his wife and everything he had. An important statement there because it helps us to understand that Pharaoh could have taken everything away, Pharaoh could have killed Abram, but he's worried. He's worried about the curse that he's endured and doesn't want to make anything worse. And with that, we have a couple of minutes, and we went through an awful lot today. So what other questions do you have? Is there anything you've been thinking as we've been going through that together?
So, Abram, because of culture, was able to get by with telling a lie.
Yeah.
And then in the end, he was even rewarded for it because
Yes.
he got to keep everything, including his wife,
Yeah.
and got his wife back.
Yes. That's right. Yes, the answer to that is yes. There are a number of things that happen in the Old Testament that conflict with the morals of the culture you and I live in. There's a lot of them. A lot of things. There's a woman who deceives her father-in-law into having intercourse with her by pretending to be a prostitute. And she is the one who is praised. He is the one who's cursed because he behaved inappropriately because he was supposed to. So as far as that story goes, he was supposed to have fathered a child with her after his son, her husband, died, so that the lineage would continue, so that the son's inheritance would pass on to the next son, and he refuses to do that. That is the sin of Onan, actually. So we run smack dab into cultural differences and theological differences that we're like, that doesn't match up with what I think is okay and not okay today. So what does that mean? A couple of things. One is that we're reading the story of the very beginnings of the faith that is ours today, which has changed dramatically as a result of its evolution and through the teachings of Christ in the New Covenant. The faith you and I practice today is dramatically different than its origination. Sometimes people will be like, "Oh, I don't think it is." No, it is. That's why we're not sacrificing animals on our altar. Our faith has changed a lot. There's a lot that's changed. We have, in the teachings of the New Testament, show the very beginnings of the movement away from patriarchy as an acceptable culture You see the very beginnings of that in the teachings of the New Testament, but it continues on in the evolution of our faith, right? Could be said for slavery, which is why I love those memes. I talked about them a week ago. Slavery is biblical, but it's not Christ-like, right? So we've got to be careful sometimes of saying, something is in the Bible. There are places in the Bible where slaves are commanded to obey their masters, and it's the best way to honor them. That's changed over time. We're not a people who any longer believe that slavery is in accordance with the will of God. And we'll see those kinds of things and be like, well, then why wasn't it put in there, the right way at the beginning? A couple of answers to that. One is we're not at the right way yet. We're still moving toward the right way. And the other is, again, you have Jesus saying time and again, y'all didn't get this right. You didn't codify it right. You haven't been teaching it right. The way you've written it down and practiced it wasn't right. You got a bunch of this wrong. And that's a lot of what Christ comes to change in the incarnation. So on the one hand, you're seeing an evolution of something. And then there are also moments, though, and I wouldn't argue that this is one of them, but there are also scriptural moments that give us pause to reflect about whether or not, in some cases, what we've allowed to evolve in our culture or theology is healthy. And we should ask those questions. Is where our theology is today, is that healthy? Oftentimes I'll teach this by saying this. We'll read these kinds of things from thousands of years ago, or like probably one of the better examples of stories that cause me to balk have to do with the ancient hospitality laws, where you have to protect the traveler at all costs. And so there's a story where a man throws his daughter out to be raped until she dies in order to protect the immigrant in the home. And that's praised because of the hospitality laws that are part of that culture, the patriarchy that makes women and children property of the patriarch. I see those things and balk at them. We don't believe that today. We don't believe that's in God's will. We don't believe that's commensurate with the example of the teachings or the example of Christ. And we would believe that would fall into the kind of thing where Christ would be like, yeah, you all got this wrong. But here's where I'm going with it. When I read that and I balk at it, it also makes me wonder, what will people 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now take a look at about what we do and say, oh my gosh, how could they ever have thought that that was okay to do? On the one hand, it gives me perspective, because you have people living in an era thinking that what they're doing is right, and we're looking at it later after the evolution of much theology, great deal of intervention by God to help move us a better direction, looking back on that and saying, oh my gosh, it's terrible. It gives me some perspective, so that in the midst of those stories, I can try to find what the lesson is. But one of the lessons for me is, what is it that I think is okay or normal? Maybe not just okay, maybe normal. Or what is it that I don't feel right about, but it's normal, so I live in the midst of that culture and am a part of its propagation, that people, I don't know how long from now would look at me and go, why were you complicit in this? Why did you allow this to happen? That's a good opportunity for accountability. Great question. What other questions do you have? Anything? Mm-hmm. Okay. You didn't, because, so the question is, it doesn't say that the Tower of Babel is destroyed, that people are dispersed. And that's a good question, because it doesn't in the biblical narrative say that, save that there's an indication that the punishment, and then you don't get this in English, but the punishment is going to be the reverse of what happened, which leads to the idea that it was destroyed. But the ancient stories about it all talk about it being destroyed, and so people assume that it's destroyed because of the conflagration of other stories that talk about it being done that way. Let me see if I can get the phrase, because there is a phrase there that in Hebrew sounds like we're going to do the opposite. Okay. Come, this is verse 7. Come, let's go down and mix up their languages there. so they won't understand each other's language. Then the Lord dispersed them from there over all of the earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore it's named Babel, because the Lord mixed up the language of the earth, and the Lord dispersed them all over the earth. There's a case tense there that makes it kind of sound like this. It reads in the same way that the deconstruction of the flood event happens, to where you've got one thing that happened, and the response of God was to unhappen the thing. But it's not clear or direct there. So it's the scholars will use that to justify the idea that it was torn down, in addition to the stories from other cultures that talk about it being wiped out. Yes. Yeah. Babbling land. That's why it was called Babel, right? Because it was dispersed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the political unity part of that doesn't show up in the Hebrew. And that, I think what you're seeing, New Living Translation's a bit that way. I think what you're seeing there is an entrance, a theological entrance, to help better explain what's happening. But that speaks into that scholarly theory about the trade language thing, that there's a group of people, common language, and they started to come together in that way. And there's then a destruction of that to disperse them again. Confusing thing, I know. Okay. Yeah, it's plural. Yeah, so in case you're watching, verse 7, there's another reference to the plurality there of God. So it's not something, this is a common way for God to refer to God's self. Us again, yes. Yeah. And we've talked a bit about that, so without revisiting all of that theology, there's a number of great questions there. And in fairness, we could probably answer them. If we wanted to take a look at the scriptural evidence alone, we could come up with an answer for it. But the answer we would come up with from the scriptural evidence would contradict the doctrine of our faith. And so that's where there's a juxtaposition there. The scriptural evidence alone is like pretty clear. More than one. What does the more than one look like? Male and female. We see that over and over again. But that contradicts the doctrines of the Christian faith, which is where the interpretation of that really struggles. If you were to divorce the interpretation of that text, and other cultures that study the Bible as a writing, as a genre of literature or something, don't struggle with that interpretation. We do, because the biblical evidence doesn't match the doctrinal assertions of our faith. So we're like, scholars are like, how do I fit this together? And they try pretty hard and fail. So, but yeah, that's another, what you see here is another example of the plurality of God. Worst example of that, I'll just bring this up again, are the scholars who say, well, this is the Trinity. This is evidence of the Trinity, God talking to God's self in the Trinity. No. Trinity is an extra-canonical concept in its entirety. There's nothing in the Bible that speaks of Trinity. Scholars and theologians said, here are the ways we see God in the Bible. What should we call that? A Trinity. But you don't ever see that in the Bible. So, good questions. Good questions. Wait till we get to the other chapters. It gets even harder. Anything else before I bring us to a close? Okay. Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm glad you said this. No, we're just going to do 13 next time. I want to speed through those genealogies because as much fun as they are, there's not a ton to talk about. So the next time will be 13, but the next time will not be next week. Next week I'll be speaking at a retirement ceremony in Kansas, so it'll be 2 weeks from today. I'm glad you brought that up. So we'll go 13 next time. Well, just a bit of wisdom, if it is that, based on my own study of the scriptures over the years. I would advise, the questions are good. I love asking. I have a ton of questions, and I love, every time I go through a reading, I'll come up with a few more, and I want to wrestle with them. But answering them sometimes is problematic because there aren't good answers for some of the questions, and that's okay. One of the things that we embrace in the United Methodist Church is the concept of holy mystery, that there are some things I just don't understand. Now, I want to, but some of those things, and these two passages in particular, the Abram Sarai passage and the Tower of Babel passage, they can be difficult. They can be difficult to work out. So if there is any wisdom in this advice, I want to offer it, and that is this. When it comes to reconciling what you're reading, when there's not enough evidence there to make a clear assertion, one of the questions to ask is, well, if I've always kind of believed this, but this is what I'm actually reading, and what I'm actually reading doesn't necessarily support this, then one of the questions to ask is, how do we get from here to here? And sometimes there's a really good logical train of thought there as to how we got from here to here. Other times, the two things don't match up, and that should be a pause to take a minute and say, God, what's not matching up here, and is that something that I should revisit with you, something I should think about? And then maybe look forward to the day when you can actually sit down with God together in heaven and be like, okay, what's going on? Tell me what the deal is here, because this didn't make any sense to me like the whole time I was studying it. I can't wait to do that. All right, let me pray for you. God, we're grateful for today. We're grateful for the opportunity to study, to learn, to grow, to have questions, and to wrestle with what the potential answers to those questions could mean. But God, we pray that you would give us the courage and the wisdom to wrestle in that way together with you, so that as a result of asking and wrestling with our questions, we would get to know you better in the dialogue that ensues as we seek to better understand who we are and who you're calling us to be. And all of this we just ask in your holy name. Amen. Thanks for coming, friends.